Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled Creativity in Hyperdrive, Mastering 3D Animation with Efficiency. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Kelly. I am an audience marketing manager for animation and visual effects here at Autodesk, and I will be your host today. Well, I am thrilled to introduce today's speaker for the webinar. Arturo is a talented 3D artist at Motion Lit Services. He has over a decade of freelance experience in both Los Angeles and Mexico City. So he's really made a name for himself in the industry. But his creativity really extends far beyond just his professional work. He actually has a YouTube channel, and it's amassed over 128,000 subscribers, and he has hundreds of millions of views where he creates a bunch of cool CG content and shares it online for a global audience. And recently, Arturo earned the prestigious title of Jedi Master for his animated droid submission in the Autodesk Droid Maker contest. So in collaboration with Lucasfilms, Autodesk hosted this exciting month-long competition in May, where we essentially challenge fans to design their own Star Wars-inspired droids. So today, Arturo will take you on that journey of bringing his KRD7 droid to life. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Arturo to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Happy that you were able to join us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Start our presentation. So my name is Arturo Acevedo Smith, and I created the KRD7 droid that is now a part of the Star Wars universe, which is pretty cool. And before we dive into the droid, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I did before the droid. And hang on. Okay, so this is my channel. If you do want to visit it, youtube.com/spidey406. I started the channel many years ago, actually, in 2006. So 1 year after YouTube was created. And back then I used to do stop motion animations. And then around 2012, when I started learning Maya and CG, that's when I started to make computer generated content. So here at the top left is a Bionicle one that I just finished, and that's the wireframe for it. And we're going to get to see that one. And then here's another animation I made of Spider-Man against Darth Vader. Usually in all my animations, all the modeling, rigging, animation, lighting, everything that is in there is done by me. And then here's also another animation I did of Spider-Man versus Venom and Carnage. So I'm going to pull up a video, and I'm going to kind of narrate it because I can't go through the sound of it. But first, we're going to start with the droid, in case you haven't seen it. Then we're going to go into one of the Bionicle projects, and then we're going to go into what I do with Motion Lit. So let's go ahead and start it. So here's the droid, goes in, gets the Kyber crystals, jumps out, and then it transforms into its land form. Here's the Bionicle project that I just finished a few weeks ago. There's a battle between Motoro and Nuparu. And what I did is I gave them sort of symbiotic powers, kind of like from the universes of Spider-Man and such. So what I wanted to do is kind of creatively give them different ways of fighting. And all these fluids that you see, they're all done inside Maya. They're not After Effects or anything like that. So this is all within the program, using particles, fluids, end particles, stuff like that. And some of the newer features that came out in Maya 2022, actually. So a lot of this project could not have actually been done in prior versions of Maya. And then we're going to go into what I do with Motion Lit, which is reconstruct car accidents. So here you're going to see the actual accident play out. And this car is going to come and collide with this one over here. And usually when we do these accidents, we're also going to show a top-down view of it. This is where we show approximate speed of the vehicle as it was hitting the other vehicle. In this case, we work with the lawyers for the clients, and the client was in this vehicle at the time when the other vehicle collided with it. And usually after this, we also end up showing their injuries. So we go in and we show the internal mechanism of how they were hurt, and sort of how the accident itself contributed to the injuries that they're therefore suing the other person for. And that's what I pretty much do. So I'm usually working on the channel or creating and reconstructing these major accidents. Now we're going to jump into the droid. So when I was making the droid, there's a few things that I'm going to sort of keep in mind here. So the themes are basically idea to final execution. And then I'm going to share some of the strategies and some of the techniques that I use to put this together. In making the droid, I really only had about 7 days to do it, 7 like full days with sleeping, but that's about it. And the competition was about a month, but obviously I had to do the 3D reconstructions. So I had a limited amount of time to really put this all together. And let's start with the first phase of anything. So the concept of it. With KRD7, what I did is at the start, I came up with a bunch of different sketches. There were about 7 droids to start with. And then I narrowed it down to one of the concepts that I liked. And it was this sort of octopus looking droid. And I had this, I knew it was going to store something. As you can see here in the beginning of the sketch, there's a bit of a like flame coming out of here. So earlier on, I had thought of maybe having it sort of boost into space and travel around and fly in that way. Later on, these things ended up being crystals for it. Also, I ended up going with a spider and an octopus because they share the same amount of limbs. And I figured it would be a very good way. They both have several similar aesthetics. And here you can see, this is me drawing the concept of the abdomen coming out from underneath and then it forming into the legs. So a couple of things, if you're trying to design something, always keep in mind form equals function. You'll find a lot of the most amazing creatures that we have on Earth. If you look at them, how they're designed and how they look is very much fulfilling their function. And so if you keep that in mind whenever you're making something from scratch, it's going to make your creature make sense. And the aesthetics of it are going to make sense to whoever's looking at it. A lot of the times you'll see in some movies, they'll try and take a monster out of thin air, and maybe the monster will look scary, but it won't really make sense to you because its form doesn't really make sense, right? Some of the more incredible designs, you know, if you look at Alien or Predator, a lot of how the way that they're designed is taking into account, you know, form equals function. You see the Predator with all its equipment and what it uses, and then you see the Alien and how it's designed and with its tail and kind of how it moves. They really did take a lot of design elements into account when they made those. So for KRD7, I looked at a lot of Star Wars droids, a lot of robots and stuff, and you had to choose for the competition one of like where the droid was going to belong to, you know, if it was going to be a good guy droid, bad guy droid, in what era you were going to put it in, you know, prequel, sequel, or the newer sequels. So I ended up going with the Empire, and so the droid is in the Empire stage of Star Wars, and it collects crystals, Kyber crystals, to power the second Death Star. These are the main, especially the Viper droid. I looked at this one a lot in designing the droid. You'll see the legs here of the droid coming out. These are exactly the same as the arms of my droid. The feet of the ATST are also the feet of the droid. And you'll also notice the aesthetics of this sort of blockiness and the way the details are placed onto the robot is something that I replicated in mine. You'll also see the mechanics inside the robot are very exposed. So here you can see in the front of the ATST, you can see the cables, and you can see a lot of the leg working and the pistons and how all that is coming together to make the robot. If you see some other robot designs in sci-fi, you're either covering the internal mechanism and making this really sort of fancy aesthetic on the outside. You know, you look at, for example, iRobot's robot and how they designed that one, where you can the outside, the exterior is very smooth, and then you can get a hint of the interior mechanism through the way it's refracted the materials around it. So in this case, we see a lot of the materials, and that's what I put together in mine. I'm going to jump into next slide. So for this, I'm going to kind of be talking about all these points as we get to look at sort of what it looked like when I was making this. So this is what I started out with. This is a rough version of the droid. And it's important when you're making your sketches that I showed earlier to really brainstorm in that phase, because it's going to be a lot faster to design what you want in the sketch phase than it is in this phase. So in the sketch, I already knew sort of the main shape and form that I wanted, which was the octopus. And once I have that, what I like to do in 3D is, as opposed to, it's very daunting to go into a 3D model, especially one as complex as this one, and try to make it all detailed from the get-go. So what I like to do is I get a rough proportion of what the model is going to look like. Here you can see the top head of it, the abdomen, this part. Basically, they're the main components of what I was going to be modeling. The legs are cubes, but I get to see a size of what the legs are. And so then when you're modeling, say I start detailing this one and I start, scaling it up and down, if you have the legs there while you're visualizing this, it's going to help with your proportions of, how small, how big do I want the head is. As you can see, if we start shrinking the head over here, well, now the legs look a little too big. So it's finding the right balance between the different elements that you're incorporating. And in terms of making a rough version of it in 3D, you'll see how I have very few lines in here, really. And what you want to go about doing as you're making these is, as you think of more detail, and here I have insert edge loop polygon here. As you think about more detail, you're going to go in, add a line, and that's when you start to sort of think, okay, well, what do I want to come out of here? And you can see how we start adding a little more detail, even if the detail is rough, right? And say I want to sort of make this a little thinner and add more lines here and start to play around with it. Once you have your overall form, that's when you start adding more topography to it, and you start getting something closer to this. This is a replication of the foot of the ATST that I made from scratch, just looking at the references. And then in taking that design, I started looking at some of the elements that it had. You'll notice how it has this this sort of chain looking thing on the leg, and also blending a little bit of my own stuff into it. So, for example, this little circular pattern here I designed on top of the actual design of the ATST, because I knew I was going to need several different legs to connect. If we go over to the final version of it, and we see over here, there's a little circular mechanism here, but here we have the main components of that ATST that are working. And of course, I also gave it these things. I'm going to 3 so you can see. These are like the suction cups, as if it was an octopus, right? So it's able to grab onto stuff and move the same way. And then this has the 3 parts here. You'll see the logo. This was one of the assets that was provided by Autodesk and Disney for the competition. and then I made the actual logo, just referencing that, and pasted it all over the droid, kind of giving it a signature look. Then we have over here, you can see the mask now with a lot more detail. You can also see the different iterations of the mask. You can see how here at one point, I thought that the legs I was going to put underneath the mask here, but then I ended up using this as sort of the component to replace that aesthetic. Right? You can see that there. If you look at the final design here, you can see how on the actual mask, I have these components that are from the leg on top of the mask to kind of make that similar look that I had in the sketch. That's what I have here. So a few things to bear in mind when you're modeling these things is, in my case, for the competition, it had to be 3D printed. So I couldn't really, just say, place this thing here and say, there you go, that's part of the component. It had to actually be incorporated into the mask, as you can see here. And you could make separate parts, but if you're doing kit bashing, which is really just duplicating a bunch of small components and making it look like a assembly of bigger components. If you're kit bashing, the kit bashing had to work in reality. So that was more of a challenge in making something like this. And so you have to keep clean topology for that reason. In my case, it was for 3D printing. But you also need clean topology if you're going to be moving your character. If your character is just going to settle, or maybe you're making a background object, topology isn't really going to matter. If you see some game assets, they're going to be pretty simple, especially in the background. They're not going to have a lot of lines, or they're going to be, just purely triangular formations. But if you are going to rig a character, you do have to keep that in mind. In terms of, for example, now you're able to use AI to create models just from descriptions. If you use a lot of these interfaces, they're gonna turn out an object depending on how many references they have for it. For example, if you say, I want the ATST, they're probably gonna have a bit more references for it, and the object's gonna look a lot more like an ATST than if you say the Viper Droid, because the Viper Droid is gonna be a little more obscure, and they're gonna have less references for it. But whatever you end up getting from the AI, it's the topology, and I've seen it, is not great. And a lot of the times, it may take you longer to fix the topology on what that AI object is taking out than it would be if you were to just make it from scratch with good topology. If topology doesn't matter, then, I think that's a great way to sort of use AI as a tool if you want to create your project faster, right? Because you just type it in and it comes out. The other thing that is sort of important as you're making these, whatever you're making really in CG, is you need to embrace changing your original concept or anything that's new to it. And for example, in my case, if I go back here to the initial sketch, you'll notice here, this was intended to look most like an octopus. Here's the head, and this is usually the component underneath here is the mouth of the octopus where it actually eats things. And what I ended up doing as I was modeling it is that I noticed more and more how it looked like Darth Vader's helmet. So then I embraced that idea, and I ended up giving it more design elements of Darth Vader. And so I ended up sharpening these corners here. I gave it the center line from Darth Vader. And then I made this triangular section here look more like the mouth of Darth Vader. And then you'll notice as well how in here, I gave it the lines that look like the mask, even though those same lines are actually in the abdomen portion, the one that pops out from underneath of the droid. So that's one thing. So you can embrace something that's working, even if it changes from your original concept. The other thing is maybe you're making something in 3D and it's not quite coming out the way you hoped it would, it's good to go back and look at your sketch and say, huh, well, I did something very cool at that point in time, because when you're drawing, you're not really limited by the medium that you're using. So look back at your original sketch and say, okay, what makes this sketch so cool and what is missing from what I'm modeling? And sometimes you're going to find that while you were modeling, you may have missed something that you put into your sketch, or maybe, the outline of what you're making isn't looking like what your original concept was. So it's a back and forth of you always going back to the sketch and checking, okay, am I sort of using that original vision? And then as you're making something in 3D, embracing, anything that looks maybe cooler, or something that you're liking better, and rolling with it. And that's sort of what I did as I was modeling this guy, which all the modeling that you see really took place in about 2 days. A day and a half, really, because after that I had to move on to rigging. So before we get to rigging, though, let's do shading. So I put this picture here because you can see sort of decisions that I made when I was shading. If we go back to the Viper Droid, you can see this lens here that looks kind of like what you would see if you were to wear dark glasses. And my guess is at the time, because they made all of these practical, is that they used something like that to make these eyes for the droid. And so when I made mine, I replicated that eye of the droid into all the 8 eyes that KRD7 has. You can see how it reflects and has the same kind of color that lens has. In terms of shading it, you'll notice most of Star Wars creatures, most of Star Wars robots are really monochrome, especially the ones from the Empire. They're either really dark black or a form of gray. They're not these little colorful looking characters like C3PO, for example, or even R2D2. He's mostly white, but he has a lot of color on him. And so I replicated that in that KRD7 is mostly just black and has a little bit of silver here in the internal mechanisms. And also, not only is the color monochrome in the droids, but it's also not really reflective. It's sort of very slightly like a shiny, non-shiny material. And that's what I replicated here with KRD7 as well. The other thing that ended up happening sort of by accident is you'll see this blue coating here that's coming out. And that was actually a remnant from another shader that I was using. So I ended up putting the same shader onto this one. And I was going to take this off, but then I ended up leaving it on because I figured if you're hunting these superpowered kyber crystals all the time, some of that energy is probably going to leak onto the droid. And you see a lot of times, a lot of the sort of the reconnaissance droids that they use nowadays, the ones that actually exist, a lot of what they're researching or digging gets onto the droid itself. And so I incorporated that into KRD7, where you can see the radiation of all the kyber crystals sort of getting onto the droid. And I ended up going with it and just leaving the sort of noise pattern that is on there. And that's just done through a blend shader for those of you who, are not really familiar with how this shading is. It's sort of a layered form where you can place one shader, say this, the black portion of the droid, and then on top of that, through transparency, you'll place something that has noise on it, and it's going to take, in this case, it's that bluish part of it. And then you can merge the two shaders together, and that's a blend shader. And it works just like real life. If you have a coating over a coating of paint, that's pretty much what you're doing. So now we go into rigging. So here's the actual rig of KRD7. We have the legs here. There are 2 sections to the rig. One is FK and one is IK. FK, for those of you who don't know, is forward kinematics, and IK is inverse kinematics. And I'm going to go into the project here to sort of show you what that is. So I'm going to pull up the controllers here. These are the curves that I have. The curves are what you use to control any rig or any character that you have in Maya. And controls like these, they're called nerve circles. And the reason why we use them as controls is because they don't show up in renders. So, and also because they have no information on them really, and they're really good as a way to control your geometry. You're never really selecting a piece that you model and moving that in and of itself. You're usually going to create a parent-child relationship that moves that object. This sort of kind of sits there and looks pretty, while your controls are what you're actually focusing on. So the other thing to keep in mind too is when you're rigging something is make sure that the controllers themselves are not getting in the way of animating what you're animating. So in this case, I have this big control here, and here we have more controls for the FK versions of the legs and the IK versions of the leg. One of the things I'm going to do here is, right now, everything is smoothed out, but it's not burnt in, and that it's not, I smoothed it in a way that isn't through here, right? So it's not mesh smooth. They're smooth in a way that I can go back. So the reason I do that is, for those of you who don't have, super powered GPUs while you're working in CG, the first time I was working with CG, I was doing it on a laptop from 2011 in 2012, and it couldn't really take a lot of polygons. So one of the techniques that I use is, instead of having all of this already smooth, if I go in here and press 1, you're going to see how that is still there. And this version is going to be a lot nicer to the processor than this version. So if I select all of this and make it all 1, then we have the lower subdivided version of it. And this one, you'll see, is way smoother at moving. So that's the one I actually animated. Then when I'm all nice and done and everything's ready, that's when I go in and smooth all of it. So in this case, you'll see drops the Kyber crystals, gets out of there, and this is where the IK and FK switching happens. So right now, the IK that's going on, you'll notice how, as it's dipping and going up, how these legs are all responding to it. I'm not actually animating the legs here. I'm only having to animate this, and I'll show you. So if I move this guy around, you'll notice how all the legs respond to that. And that's what IK is great for. But where you don't use IK is when you're floating around, jumping, moving the character around, and any of its limbs don't have to react to the terrain. So here in this case, when it's swimming, you'll see how I have it come out of the swimming pattern with all the legs swooping out and landing there. Now, as they land, they switch to that IK. And the way you control IK as well is, not just by it responding, but you can also move controllers here. So let me go ahead and move this. You'll see how as I move it, it'll move the leg. And then in my case, I ended up jerry-rigging 2 IKs together so that one of them can move the leg, and then the other can slide the leg where it needs to be. And I did that because you'll notice how really the turning for my leg only goes vertical. There isn't really room for any horizontal movement in these chains. So I would use this to line it up so that I wouldn't break that element of it. And then when it's being controlled through FK, what you have is it moves more like you would move a toy. So the body will move, and then you can come in here and move this section of it. And I have a control for every rotation that ends up happening. See? And as it rotates where it should be rotating. And this is all done through constraints. You can see here in the hierarchy how I have that control is under that one, which is under that one, so on and so forth, all connected to the leg top control, which are all connected to this control, which if I move this, it's going to move the whole character. And this is how all characters, everything you see in movies, in visual effects, this is pretty much how they're set up. There's a million different ways of doing and executing the same thing, but the principle is always the same. And so that is what I have here. Let's show you. So when I was making this, in terms of the camera, the reason I leave it here and it just sort of moves and pans down with the droid and then it goes up is because you need to convey, we only had 8 seconds to convey what the droid can do in the animation, or just what the droid can do in general. So if you have one camera shot for all of this, then it's going to be a lot easier for the audience to take in all the information that you're giving it visually as to, okay, so first the droid is swimming, it can land, it can grab kyber crystals. That's how this part of it functions, goes in, places the kyber crystals, and then jumps out, gets out of there. Originally, this took a lot longer, so I had to shorten it because by this point we were already at 8 seconds. So, and we needed a lot more time because I wanted to show it coming out and landing. You'll notice this pose here that it does before it lands. That's usually how spiders actually end up jumping, and they end up curling their legs like that when they jump sometimes. So there's the landing, and then it ultimately transforms. And you don't really notice it in the animation, but it's in there. This little wheel that comes down here is the same as R2D2's. And it also is the same as the little robot that comes out in Star Wars that sort of chases them while they're on the Death Star. A little black thing. That's basically the same kind of black robot that I put here. And this wheel also has enough space to be stored in there. And it has its own control to move it as well. And here you see also in the abdomen the aesthetics of the Viper droid. Here it has the same little cylindrical sections to it, and these blocky sort of indentations that go in. You can see that there. And you can also see how I was talking about earlier in terms of the amount of lines that you're using. So most of this, up until the final version of it, did not look like this. All these lines that you see were pretty much gone. It's just, I just had sort of the lines that I needed, which would be this one, this one, that one, and then the ones on the side. And that's it. And then later on, you end up adding more lines. And that's how you create the actual one. So that when I smooth it out, you get these nice beveled sections. You can also bevel edges themselves without doing this. I prefer using this method, but you can also use the other method as well if you don't want to, use all the polygons. So in games, for example, they won't do this a lot. They'll just bevel edges on their own mostly. Now for lighting and rendering. So for the lighting, we'll jump back into the scene here. And I'm going to hide this and show the lights. So what I ended up doing is I have 2 directional lights here. So one is meant to be sun coming in through the cave, which is also coming into through the water and lighting up that whole scene. And then I'm creating an artificial bounce with the light. And I do this a lot where I'll create artificial bounces where I want the light to bounce off of, because in most programs you can get that naturally, but the amount of bounces you usually have to put in order to get what you want artistically is a lot of computational power. So there's artificial ways of creating your lighting. And then I also knew as I was making this that these kyber crystals were also going to be a key light. So these kyber crystals are able to self-illuminate, but I also have an invisible light in front of the kyber crystals, which is casting a blue light onto the robot. And that's what you see here. So this isn't really coming directly from the kyber crystals. That's a light that I have in there. And I've been showing this section because this is the program that I use to put all the layers together. So what you get out of Maya, you're going to get a set of renders. Here's what the renders look like. So as you can see, it's pretty different from the final product. What I end up doing in Maya a lot when I have my renders is I'll take it about 70 to 80% of where I want it to go in terms of lighting. So in this case, you know, the overall quantity of light is in there. The quality of the light isn't really finalized. And so what you can do is out of Maya, you take out your renders, and whether you're using, you know, Arnold or V-Ray or any package, it's going to give you out the elements that you want. And then once you have all the elements isolated, in this case, these are the different elements that come out. And for example, this is lighting, this is global illumination, the reflection layer, refraction layer, specular layer. You can kind of tell what each layer is just by seeing them. Atmosphere and self-illumination, and finally glare. And what you're able to do is manipulate each of these in their own way to get what you want. So in this case, the specular, throw a little color correct in there, give it a little glow, and then merge it with the other layers. And then once you have all those layers together, I then go and start to add a few more things to it. You know, give it a grade, give it a glow, another grade, and all of that contributes to the final look of the robot. And you'll see the same thing if we take it out over to this section. I'm going to go back to where it jumps. Over here. And here's, for example, we can isolate the elements of what's coming out of that foam. And then I color correct it, blur it out to take away that noise, then mask it out, and finally merge it to the top, and then composite it all together. You'll notice how the main color correction that I'm doing is happening after I've fused these two elements together so that they can look like they're part of the same blend, right? Always keep the glow here of the Kyber crystals as well. You can see that as it lands. The other thing you'll notice with the eyes of this guy, which I didn't notice till later, but my mother pointed out, is she noticed how the reflection, the way it's cast here, it makes it look like it has little eyes, which is here, you can see it too. Like this is the part of the eye here, the center of the eye. So it's pretty cool effect that ended up coming out just from the material and the way it's reflecting all the light here. So now we're going to talk a little bit about AI and 3D artists, because that is something that is coming out the past few years. And there's a few points that I'd like to make on it. So within the world of CG, as soon as you go into it, you're going to hear the term generalist or specialist. And these terms meant a lot more, I think, 10 years ago than they do now, because there's a lot of areas as specialists that perhaps they haven't really gotten replaced so much as they're a lot faster to do. So, for example, I just showed you several phases of how to make the actual robot and then render, right? Every phase that I showed you in the industry has a specialist for it. So a specialist is going to model, a specialist is going to rig, a specialist is going to animate, and so on and so forth. I like to create everything myself. And the advantages that you have when you do that is, for example, I knew exactly what I was going to need to animate. And so I created the rig for it. And in a way, the actual animation ended up taking about half a day to create. And that's because of the rig that I made. The rig took longer to make than it took to animate the actual robot. And if I was making like a lot longer animation, you'd end up saving a lot more time because you have a good rig. So the advantages of when you're a generalist is you get to, if there's any troubleshooting or any problems down the line, you get to fix those. If you're a specialist, the issue you're going to run into is a lot of the times companies will need different people for different things. And sometimes they'll want the same person to have a bunch of different hats. And so my recommendation is perhaps there are aspects of CG that you like and don't like. Focus on the ones that you like, and they can be more than one. So I would not pigeonhole yourself into, oh, I'm only going to do lighting because I should choose it, even though I also like modeling. Do both. And at the end, you're going to grow in all of those, anything that you specialize, you're going to grow in, and everything that you're maybe generalized in, you're also going to grow in. So there's no point in cutting yourself off from it, especially the way the industry is looking now. In terms of AI, right? AI is going to, in many ways, make certain processes faster, but you don't know which field it's going to really affect, especially in the world of 3D. Right now, perhaps it's starting to tinker with modeling. So if you're just specialized in modeling and you don't know any of the other aspects, then perhaps AI could be more of a threat to you. And that's why I bring up this generalization versus specialization. In the future, as AI gets better, I do see it being more of a tool for generalists and more of an advantage for generalists, and probably more of a threat for specialists as the technology gets better. So something to kind of bear in mind. The other thing to keep AI is you need to look at it as sort of a tool set and not really something that's going to, end what you're doing or end your career. Because in a way, us CG artists, we've always been working with a form of AI. When you go from 2D animation to 3D animation, it ends up replacing all the in-betweeners, right? Everybody that ends up drawing all the poses that come between two key animation poses. CG ended up replacing that. 2D animation is still alive. Obviously, there's a lot of it out there. And we work with CG all the time. AI is just guessing. It's guessing using references. And so when you're making something, the more reference you give it, in other words, the more information you give it, the better the computer is going to be able to guess. And in my case, when I'm animating, right, I'm animating pretty much every other frame. So the computer is only guessing one frame between two frames in say a 24 frames per second animation. And the more I let the computer guess, the more strange it looks. And that applies still to AI. AI needs a lot of human interaction to make it look good because the AI is always guessing. And so you can use it as a tool, but at the end of the day, it still needs a lot of human interaction. And, with CGI and the way computer modeling and the way Maya works, you're always using a form of AI. It's just becoming a little more advanced and perhaps can make your workflows faster, depending on how you use it. The other thing is, in terms of AI, since it's always using references, if you're creating something out of scratch, the AI is just probably not going to be able to do it. I don't know if you've used those AIs where you type in a sentence or a phrase, and I'm sure for those of you that can imagine what you're typing, at least for me, when I imagine it, I say, okay, I want a giant tarantula attacking Jupiter with lava in the background. And I actually tried that with AI, and I had a vision of it in my head. And then I saw what AI took out, and it was completely not what I imagined. It looked quite terrible. And so in a way, that's where AI is really going to struggle, is anything that you have, whenever you have this vibrant imagination, you're really going to be the only person that can execute what you're envisioning. The computer's not going to be able to do that. And it's going to show too with whatever you create. Everything you create is going to have a little touch of you in it. And the AI is basically just has a touch of everyone in it because it's using references from everyone. And so it's always an amalgamation of everyone's work. Whereas when you're actually creating something as an artist, it starts to have this own unique look, your own unique way of doing things. And that's always going to come across. And I really don't see AI being able to execute that in its current form because it's not truly artificial intelligence yet. They just call it AI because it sounds cool, but it's still just guessing. It's just guessing based on references. So, that's something to keep in mind.
So before you all go, if you liked what you saw today, if you want to see more content like this, please be sure to register for AU 2024. It's the Design and Make conference hosted by Autodesk. And this year it's taking place October 15 to the 17 in San Diego. It's really a great opportunity, one for professional growth and for learning. We have a ton of sessions led by industry professionals. So for instance, you can hear from folks at Rodeo Effects on how they bring the dragons to life in season 2 of House of the Dragons, or even from Autodesk experts directly on how you can leverage AI tools today to enhance your workflows. And if you can't join in person, don't worry. You can actually register for a digital pass and it's completely free. So all you have to do is go to autodesk.com/AU2024 and get your free digital pass to access really hundreds of learning content. So that's all we have. Thank you so much for joining today, and a huge, huge thank you to Arturo for his fantastic presentation.